Hello and welcome back to Movie Husbands. Today we'll be reviewing Bottoms. Directed by Emma Seligman, the film stars Ayo Edebiri, Rachel Sennett, Ruby Cruz, and many more. Matt, what do you think of Bottoms?
Before I get into Bottoms, I do want to talk about Emma Seligman for a moment because her first movie came out a couple years ago, and that was Shiva Baby. I absolutely adore that movie, and so this is her follow-up sophomore film.
It was your number 2 of that year.
It was my number 2 of that year, that's right. And also had Rachel Sennett in that main character role as well in Shiva Baby. So they're paired again for this movie. They both have writing credits on this movie. It looks like they wrote it together. As far as comparing these two movies go, I would say in a general perspective, I think I liked Shiva Baby a little bit more. I think overall it was a bit more of a serious and complex movie that came together really well in all its little intricacies. Overall, though, I really enjoyed this movie. I thought it was outright hilarious. I think for better or worse, so much of a different direction. It is basically your raunchy comedy romp. I would almost compare it to like your Superbad or your Booksmart, but it is just so much more insane than that. Yeah. I think this is one of those first raunchy comedies for Generation Z. I loved how this movie looks at violence and it really just makes a joke out of it in a way that's both serious and unserious, but almost alluding to the desensitivity of Generation Z and violence, because I feel like we live in a little bit more of a violent world than we were 10, 15 years ago. The way that Generation Z deals with comedy in this regard, and I see a lot of it on TikTok, is just so harshly pointing out the problems. So it's one of the things I really enjoyed about this movie, how it utilizes comedy in that sense.
It's strange to say this about a film that came out a couple days ago, but it's a film that you could look back a couple of years and say it was ahead of its time. And in a certain way, I think this is a comedy that really encapsulates what I understand to be Gen Z. I know that we're like older millennials or whatever we are, looking back on Gen Z and saying we understand their humor and there's flaws in that, and I understand that. But the humor, especially what I've seen on TikTok, is particularly dark, and I don't really blame them because I think they're coping with a very dark world and a world that's constantly publicizing its darkness. I think a question that's asked a lot with both good intentions and bad intentions is, how do you be funny in a post-cancel culture world? This film's answer to that is you simply make everything a target. There's no one in this film that is not a target, that is not the butt of the joke. I think the film is shooting so many bullets from his gun that treating everything as a target in a way kind of alleviates some of the offensiveness of the film. I know this sounds bizarre, I even hesitate to say this. The film has a rape joke in it that I found funny, and I don't laugh at rape jokes ever. I don't think it's a funny thing to talk about in that way. The way that the film does it is it tries to satirize how we identify with women who have seen sexual violence. It's dealing with a lot of heavy subject matter, but I think the satirical way that it approaches that subject matter is quite fun and very farcical. It feels like a farce the entire way.
We actually heard some criticism about this movie in terms of the movie not really building these two main characters and their friendship first, and giving you a sense of that in the movie.
And it being overly hateful.
Yeah, and I think this movie really just thrushes you into this world rather than letting you pick out and get to learn these people first.
I agree with that. I also think the film is just not particularly interested in character. I think their characters are maybe two-dimensional, but definitely not three-dimensional. You learn a little bit about them, but they're really more there to be chess pieces in this overall satire that's making fun of various ideas in our culture, right?
Yeah, I think the satire is definitely number one on the priority list for this movie. There were so many jokes in the film. One were about how the government owns her vagina. Mm-hmm. There's this great joke that they have about the teacher that's helping them run or manage the club. He goes through this process of, he sees the girls behaving badly at one point and he totally gives up on feminism, which is something he was like first an ally of, and then he so quickly let it go. And I think that speaks to a lot of people in this country right now who see something bad and they immediately discount like an entire group or movement of people.
Yeah, I saw looting on TikTok, so suddenly like they have no point for what they're talking about. Yeah, it's ridiculous. The teacher is one of my favorite parts of the film. I think he's very, very funny. I also think he perfectly encapsulates what you were talking about earlier, where you're just very strictly throwing this issue at the wall and saying, here's what's going on. It's such clear satire, like you really can't miss it, that I found the teacher to be the funniest part, actually. Who's played by Marshawn Lynch, who is a football player. I did not know that. I Googled his name and there was a gigantic Wikipedia article on him. Neither one of us watch football, so anyway.
Yeah, I do not watch football. Going from there, I guess since we're talking about actors, we could go back to Rachel Sennett. I think this role actually showed the diversity she has as an actress, because her role in Shiva Baby is very much anxiety-ridden and close to the chest, like a bubbling of emotions that slowly percolate throughout that movie. This movie, she is very blatantly cold and calculating and weaselly, like trying to get something out of this. It really sticks apart from her last role, which I think just shows the wonderful complexity of her acting abilities. And then from there, we have her best friend in the movie, Rosie, who's played by Ayo Edebiri. We absolutely love her in The Bear. She's fantastic in that. And I really think she's one of the people that stole the movie.
She's a perfect counterbalance to Rachel Sennon's character. She's a lot more reasonable. She's a lot more grounded. She's very funny too, and she has many great lines, but she's almost more the straight man that she's like, we're going to do what? You know, and she's along for the ride.
Yeah, she's like very aware of the consequences of these actions and what could happen from them.
Yeah.
Where Rachel Sennon's character just basically ignores them all to just try to get what she wants out of this scenario. But even though we don't get so much of their friendship together, we do get their distinct personalities that create this friction between both of them that is done very well. And also this comedy that just bounces off both of them too.
So I take some issue with the film, particularly in its structure. I thought that the film was above its sort of typical 3-act structure. So I always call it the mid-comedy crisis. There's always this crisis, this problem that arises about, you know, an hour into a comedy that needs to be solved so everybody can be brought back together for a triumphant end, right? It has it in a way that's genuine, which feels like such a diversion from the farcical elements of the first hour of the movie. So it really didn't work for me. So if you were going to do a mid-comedy crisis or a low point of the screenplay and you were going to satirize it as it's part of this farce, I would be down with that. But I think the film is just so far above having that kind of structure that it almost feels like a studio wanted them to put it in. I have no idea if that's true or not. It felt like such a left turn to me that I thought that the film was so much smarter without that structure. And then that's when they try to make the friendship work for me after not having built much of the friendship because they're focusing far more on the comedy and the tone and the overall outlandish atmosphere. That like 15 to 20 minutes really took me out of the movie. And I really liked the final 10 minutes. I thought that was funny. The only other issue I have with it is I more had a smile on my face just enjoying the general ridiculous atmosphere than I did laugh out loud at, you know, 100 different jokes. Those are my two main issues with the movie. I would say that the comedy structure of it is probably my biggest issue. And again, it really took me out of the film for a period of time.
Like, I understand the satirical aspects are the deeper parts of the movie, but to me, it didn't really feel like it was a deeper movie. And I know it wasn't really going for that, but I feel it could have benefited more from an underlying meaning or something that tied the entire movie together that was more important than just the comedy.
I agree. I think the film is so scattershot and so cynical that it ultimately doesn't have a moral, which doesn't bother me that much. But again, that structure thing where you're trying to make me feel something that feels so shoehorned in compared to the rest of the film that's doing so much to make fun of our culture. It just, I don't know, it didn't jive with me. And especially this is a 90-minute movie, which, by the way, very thankful for all 90-minute movies that exist. So let's make more of them. But when you have 20 minutes of a 90-minute movie that's really not working, then that's a good enough part of their runtime to have some criticism, I think.
And what's interesting is that's one of the things that I think Shiva Baby had that this movie didn't. And there's this running thing in Shiva Baby where she's so wrapped up in her disappointment with herself and also the expectations her family puts on her that it weighs so anxiously on her mind.
Yeah.
And the movie underlyingly expresses these things. And by the end, all it takes is this one little scene in the car where she takes the other main actress's hands and they just hold each other in the car ride while their family is just yapping in the front of the car.
Yeah.
In that one moment, just everything that you needed about her character and how she progressed throughout the course of the movie.
Yeah, and that's a slightly touching moment in a film that's pretty barbed and pretty cynical. But that's, I think, as you said, all you needed. If this film is going to do something like that, I think it only needed just a hint of it instead of a whole structure of it.
All right, so you ready to go to grades?
Yeah, I give Bottoms a B-, which may sound kind of low, but again, that structure thing really didn't work for me. And also, I didn't seem to find it as funny as the rest of the theater did. But I did enjoy myself for the most part. To be honest, I haven't thought about it a ton since we saw it 2 days ago. I do think it has a ton of originality in it. I could see somebody being really inspired by this film and making something far better. I think Emma Seligman probably has a better film in her too. I think she's an amazing talent, and there's just such a great cast here. There's a lot to like, but again, I think there's some flaws too.
I agree with everything you said. I think overall, I give this movie a B+. I did enjoy it much more than you did in terms of the laughing aspects. I did find
you
so
did
much
laugh
more
more than me. And actually, a quick observation: you're usually not a big laugher during comedies. We've watched comedies together where you didn't laugh the whole time, and at the end you're like, "That was so funny." but you really laughed a lot during this movie.
I really found it hysterical. It was just the quippiness, and it didn't end. It went throughout the movie. There was so many little things, like the bomb that went off on the car during the middle of the movie.
The character who obsessively wants to kill her stepdad was one of my favorite parts of the movie.
There's the other one that just constantly screams, like, at everything. All these characters have these little idiotic things about them that are so funny. This movie did have a lot of things packed into it in terms of all those satirical things. So I think there's a lot of things you could go back and look at and just realize, oh, maybe I didn't notice that the first time watching the movie.
I'm glad we reviewed this movie because I think we tend to only review movies that we absolutely love, and we're just like, every movie's an A on this channel. You know, as we talk about all the best movies or all the movies we think are the best movies. So I'm glad to review something that I think is maybe a little bit more middle of the road for us. So
I agree, but I also think that this movie really pushed a lot of boundaries in terms of comedy.
I agree. I think it did too. I think you can look back on it in a couple of years and say that was the imperfect film before the perfect encapsulation of this type of humor came along. And that's it for a review of Bottoms, which is now playing in theaters. Go check it out in theaters. Let us know what you think in the comments, and we will see you next time.